Hello, everyone, and welcome to Module 3 of Foundations of Social Justice. We are halfway through our course, meaning we have about 4 weeks left together. In this module, we're going to look at some of the obstacles or barriers and also some of the solutions to building equity and social justice in our schools, particularly in relation to academic achievement. So one of the obstacles that we can focus on is our mindset, and so we're going to spend a few minutes looking at that now. In education, we often talk about achievement gaps. We give a test, whether it's a standardized test, a county assessment, or a normal classroom test. And as educators, we've been told that we need to analyze the data and see what that tells us about our students. Often, this leads to us identifying the achievement gap. And an achievement gap leads to deficit thinking. It leads us to think that this group of students is not performing where they're supposed to be. When we assume deficits in our students, and we've all done it, we hear expressions like, this kid is reading at the 6th grade the reading level, even though he's in 10th grade. Or, this group of students is not able to master the algebra and MCAP exam, so they have some deficits in math. The question that we need to ask ourselves is the deficit with the students, or is the deficit in the system that's supposed to serve the students? And we can notice that there are two different mindsets based on this idea. If we assume that the deficit is with the students, then we put interventions in place and we try to get the student back up to where they're supposed to be. So we focus on reducing the deficit instead of focusing on the potential for growth. Think about that mindset for both the teacher who's working with the student, trying to minimize a deficit, and also think about that mindset for the student, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. We think about deficit from the perspective of placing blame on the student. We forget to consider growth and opportunities growth for that student as well. The student may have a deficit in one area, but they might also have great growth in another area. And what are we sacrificing by focusing too much on the deficit? Are we giving up growth in other areas? We could also consider this problem from, is there a deficit in the system? When we ask that question or we take that perspective, we consider different things. We consider the instructional practices. Is instruction relevant? Is it engaging? Is it culturally responsive? We can also examine the assessments. Is it measuring what it's intended to measure? Does it have a bias towards a certain group of students? We might also think about the learning environment. Is it welcoming? Does the student feel that they belong? Do they feel that their voice is represented in that learning environment? We can also take this thinking to other parts of our school, not just achievement on tests. Let's look at discipline, for example. Does a student with discipline referral have a deficit in expected behavior, or have we placed him in the wrong learning environment? The questions also come up in a lot in our discussion boards is, who's defining the expected behavior? We could also talk about this in the context of our colleagues as well. Let's take a new teacher, for example. A new teacher in our hypothetical situation is not making progress on her writing SLO with her 10th grade students. Are we going to place blame on the teacher, or do we place blame on the system? Is it because she doesn't know how to teach, or is it because the curriculum is not solid, or that she doesn't have the resources in place to support her? I think this is an important thing to consider. Deficit mindset might be holding kids back. And is it a matter of a difference in the system, or is it a matter of difference in the student? This work is pretty important because when we think about our biases, that could also think about how we grade students, whether we're grading those students with a deficit mindset or grading those students with a growth mindset. Another thing that we should think about when we're thinking about the achievement gap comes from the work of Gloria Ladson Billings, who's out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She says that we don't just have an achievement gap in this country, we have an education debt in this country. And in her work, she explains this idea, largely comparing it to the national debt. Each year, the nation, Congress, produces a budget. And in most recent history, every year there's a deficit. And over time, those deficits add up to increase the national debt. Ladson Billings says that we do have the same thing in our education system, that the United States history is full of events that have led to educational inequities. And you can probably think of many just sitting here listening to this. So think about that. If we have a group of students who have a deficit, which we usually call an achievement gap, those deficits add up and leads to our debts. The other thing that we have to consider is when you have a debt, you have to pay interest on a debt. So what does that look like in our schools? We can think of our students of color. We can think of our students from our low-income backgrounds. One of the debts that we have to pay is building trust with those communities. And when we have to spend a lot of time building trust, what are we not able to do? We're not able to focus on as much achievement. We're not able to focus as much on growth as well. So this idea of achievement gaps leading to deficits, what is the long-term consequences and how do we fix those things? I would argue that Ladson Billings is telling us that this is another system which is leaving our children behind, particularly our children of color and other minority populations. Think about that as we go into this module. So let's take a look at what we're going to do in Module 3 and Module 4. Well, Module 3. In Module 3, you do have some readings. Our first reading, Good School, Rich School, talks about our major obstacle being funding. Seeing Their Strength talks about deficit mindset and growth mindset, particularly with our English language learners. This TED Talk, Isn't It a Pity?, will help us think about our disabled population and how we view and treat those students as well. There's 2 discussion forums in this module. The first one asks you to think of the obstacles to teaching with social justice in your classrooms and how we overcome those obstacles in different ways. The second one I've tried to make as relevant as possible to our times, and it asks you to think about your isms, think about some of the obstacles, and then think about our current situation, either virtual learning or hybrid learning, whichever model your school system is currently using, and then apply those isms and apply some of those barriers and some of those gaps that we've started to see exposed in our education system. And then identify some of the best practices or some of the great work that you've seen with your colleagues or yourselves to try to minimize those gaps in our virtual learning environment. You do have a major assignment in Module 3, and most of you have already started to work on it, and that is the Myspace photography project. Remember, in this project, you're looking at the culture of your school and the holistic environment of your school. Many of you have emailed because you don't have easy access to your building, or you might have limited access to your building. It's okay to be creative. It's okay to use old pictures. It's also okay to focus more on the community if you need to. I want you to also spend some time thinking about your final project. Your final project asks you to meet with a focus group. In this module, your goal is to develop a plan. Your plan needs to be posted in the discussion forum. Your plan should be about a paragraph. Identify your group. Identify the questions that you're going to ask. When you're gathering those questions, think about a theme. When you look at the example that's posted, their focus was on assessments. How much are we assessing people? And are we putting the right accommodations in place? So think about those things. So again, remember, sorry about this, computer's acting weird. Remember that you should be identifying the group, creating your survey, and planning a collection method. Again, in our current environment, it's kind of difficult to interview people. Feel free to set up a Zoom or a Google Meet if time allows. Also, some flexibility. Feel free to email people some questions as well. You might not get the same takeaways. You might not get as much out of it, but in the situation, we might have to work with that. We might have to work with more emails than face-to-face meetings. If you have any questions, reach out as always. I look forward to seeing you on the discussion boards, and also want to remind you that our next optional discussion will be on November 23rd, and I will post a reminder later in the week. Take care of yourself and stay well, everyone.